Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people.
It's September, and for many OECD countries, it's back to school time. Except that this year, back to school is a whole different proposition because of COVID-19. Since the virus began circulating in January 2020, and perhaps even earlier, it's been a roller coaster ride for students, teachers, parents, and administrators around the world. Overall, 188 countries temporarily closed their schools in the first half of 2020. This affected more than 1.5 billion young people, and some schools that reopened have had to switch back to remote learning, sometimes just days later, as the virus transmission in classrooms sped up. What are the trade-offs between getting kids back to school and keeping communities healthy? How can schools adapt to COVID? And will this virus radically change the way we learn and teach? I'm Clara Young, and here to discuss all this and more is Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD. Thanks for speaking to us, Andreas.
Thanks, Clara.
Now, there's intense focus right now on how to open the new school year, and what's making people nervous is that back to school is happening as the infection rate remains high or is going up. Even Korea, which has been a model country in terms of testing, tracking, and tracing, has put schools back online in Seoul and other hard-hit areas, and that's because students and teachers are testing positive. So is it safe to go back to school, Andreas?
Yeah, I think we can reconcile safety and health and education in schools. There may be individual school closures necessary. I think that's quite clear and the conditions require. But overall, I'm quite confident. In fact, even before the summer break, we found a number of countries that were able to manage this quite well with social distancing in place and good training of staff and good awareness among students. I do think that is possible. The cost of not doing this to individual students, to society, is very high.
Let's talk about the costs. What risks do we run by having a disrupted school year and by closing schools?
Yeah, for students who don't have, the right technology at home, who do not have the parents to create a good supporting environment, who do not have access to, great people helping them, and most importantly, who have never learned how to study on their own. I think this has been devastating.
Right.
We think about, for individuals, we talk about, maybe 3% dent in lifetime income.
Yes.
This is a heavy, heavy cost, and it is incurred particularly to the most marginalized students. So in a way, this crisis has exacerbated the many inequalities that we already have in education.
So what are we doing about that?
The home environment, a lot has happened. Many young people have now at least, technology at home. Systems have also become more responsive to the technologies that's actually available. Like in some countries, computers may not be there, but mobile phones are. And television has played an important role. You can look to Spain. Some countries have been very creative in creating a broader mix of technologies. It's not so much, I think, the hardware is very much about the software and the people, really. I think, it's about building this kind of personal fabric between students and teachers. And that's really the crunch point.
I think that some of the findings that are coming out are that student engagement when in the online classroom is difficult.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. It's learning is always a relational process. It's about that personal interactions. The one thing that young people will take away from this whole experience is, did I have a teacher who realized, my passions, my dreams? Did I have that kind of personal support and understanding? And where students feel it, they're going to go out of their way in learning. But where students feel this is just about broadcasting, whether by a teacher or by a computer, they're going to disengage. And once again, the most marginalized students are most at risk of losing out in this.
Right. What are some techniques that are working and what are things that are not working in remote teaching?
If you have a teacher just delivering a lecture on Zoom, that's not very effective. That's basically, old teaching using new technology. I think you need to change your pedagogy. You need to capitalize on the opportunities of technology, not making learning more, more interesting, more engaging, more granular, more personal, and then bring in the personal aspect, the support, the coaching, the mentoring on a one-by-one basis. And I think if you use that combination, you're going to be a very effective teacher. Technology can amplify good teaching, but it doesn't replace poor teaching.
It's possible that the pandemic could make us more ready to experiment and to take on new technologies. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, that's not just possible. That is actually happening. I've seen more technological innovation, but also more social innovation in schools in the last few months and in many years.
Could you tell us about that? Like some interesting examples?
Well, the most obvious one is the use of technology. In the question of the what and how we learn, basically, it's not just about, the accumulation of subject matter content. It's really, can you set your own learning goals? Can you manage your learning process? Do you have the metacognitive abilities, the resilience actually to work through hardships? Can you work on complex problems? Can you, study for sustained periods of time? Many schools and teachers have understood that actually learning is boundaryless. Like we can actually combine learning in school and out of school. Typically, schools are very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. And I think this pandemic has inverted that. The connections with society have become so important, and many schools have really done that well. And I'm pretty sure a lot of this will remain after the pandemic.
Let's get back to some of the safety aspects of reopening schools. What are you picking up on about best practices for going back?
Well, actually, this is perhaps the aspect I've been most surprised at. I would have expected, social distancing is going to be easy in university and high school. It's going to be really tough in primary school. And actually, we've seen pretty much the reverse. I think young children understand very well when you instruct them, when you explain that to them, they adhere to those kinds of safety protocols, the health protocols. I think is quite well established, even wearing masks in social spaces. But you need to do a lot around that. You need to, you have capacity constraints. Classes will be smaller, and certain subjects obviously are much more risky than others. Singing, dancing is obviously more complex than math and science. So you see changes in the curriculum. I think the hardest challenge is local capacity. You need to have school leaders and you need to have teachers who take, individual responsibility. They need to understand there is a problem with health. I need to intervene. I need to take, maybe have to put a classroom in quarantine. I may have to, help support a teacher and so on. So I think there's huge demands on schools, have been run like factories in a one-size-fits-all method, and that no longer works. Now you really need schools who are very closely related to the community, and part of this is building trust. You can reopen a school, but whether parents come and students come very much depends on whether you can make a compelling case that you actually reconcile the education and the learning with the safety and the health of students, teachers, and the environment.
I think schools have also been using all kinds of organizational techniques like staggered recreational times, staggered meal times, staggered classes, all that.
Yeah, and I think, again, there are now well-established practices on how to implement social distancing in schools to ensure that you need to coordinate public spaces to limit congestion, all of those things. But again, schools have been quick in most countries to figure out how to do this.
I read that in Denmark, there were some schools that were giving classes in graveyards so that the students could have a place, space and air. And in India, I think that there, in some poorer areas, teachers were using loudspeaker systems to teach. So I think teachers have really been coming up with new ideas to try to deal with the pandemic.
Yeah, 9% of learning is now planned for out of the school building. And I think it's actually great.
Oh, as high as that? Okay.
Yeah, it's actually a great experience. If you think about science, science is about observing nature, experimenting. And I think the outdoors can be a fantastic environment to support some of this. It's going to be more difficult in wintertime, but I actually think, again, there has been a lot of creativity out there.
Now, what about resources to help teachers and students with mental health issues? There's a lot of anxiety, there's isolation.
It's very high on the agenda when you actually survey schools. We have some data on this. It's about between 70 and 90% of schools across countries who have actually arrangements for this in place. At the very same time, very few schools and school systems have been able to hire a specialist capacity for that. So most of this really rests on the shoulders of teachers. As a teacher, you're no longer just an instructor anymore. You're now also, a coach, a mentor, a psychologist, a social worker.
Right. And are they getting training?
There's a lot of training available, but again, much of that is online. So it depends on teachers, accessing those kinds of resources. But I think in a number of countries, provision for that has developed quite a bit. I think the bigger challenge is that, teachers are often not well connected among themselves. They work with a high degree of professional autonomy, but not really in a collaborative culture.
Yes.
So I think that's, in my view, the bigger part, not the training, but you cannot share your experience. You cannot, consult with colleagues. You have a pretty high number of teaching hours, so that leaves you relatively little time to do other things than teaching.
What about students who fell behind during the school closures? The International Labor Organization survey found that 65% of young people, they said that they have learned less since the pandemic, and 9% think that they're going to fail. What should be done for students who are falling behind?
Well, that's my biggest concern and worry. It's going to be very, very hard for young people to catch up. Some countries like Germany have, during the vacation, put a lot of provision in place that was prioritized for the most marginalized students who have fallen behind. I also think when schools are reopening and have capacity constraints, it's really important to give priority to those students who need that pastoral support most. But the reality is, when school students come back, you'll find a lot more diversity in student needs. Classes have already been heterogeneous with a lot of diversity, and now that's going to be amplified. So whether those children will catch up, unfortunately, statistically, past experience suggests it's not good news. I think the reality is what happens in schools tends to reinforce, not moderate, social disparities. So I think there's a lot that school systems need to do to redouble their effort with extra time, with extra support for the students who struggle most. Some students have completely tuned out. If you look to countries like Italy and Spain, these are double-digit figures of students who basically have got lost in a way.
Which is worrisome, yeah.
And it's not just that they lost learning, they may have even lost trust in school. For many of those young people, school was the place of stability. They may not have had it in their home, not in society, but every morning they went to school. And if that place closes, you're left with nothing. And I think to get those people back really depend on teachers.
Not all is bad, though. There seems to be evidence that young people are taking initiatives in terms of their education, especially those over the age of 20. 44% of the people surveyed by the International Labor Organization pursued new training courses since the start of the pandemic. And young people have also been volunteering in great numbers. So can we build on this? Is this the beginning of something new?
Well, I think so. What we have seen is that what matters most in education is agency. Your capacity to shape your own future, your capacity to imagine, to build something of intrinsic positive worth, your capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage tensions and dilemmas, to take responsibility, to mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources. And I think a lot of this is happening. I expect after this pandemic, many young students will go to their teachers and say, well, hey, I learned how to study on my own. Why can't we do more of this in the regular classroom? And you're going to see hopefully many teachers who will say, well, teaching doesn't have to be all a one-size-fits-all model. I've learned how to teach and educate in a different way. I've become a designer of innovative learning environments. And they're going to go to the school principal and say, why can't we do that more regular? So yeah, I think the pandemic has enabled a lot of innovation, technological, social innovation. But to make that sustainable and systemic, I think it's going to be a huge challenge. There's a big risk that we just, slip back into old practice when things return to normal. Education is still, a heavy industry. Decisions are made at the top, rolled out to schools. Schools are not well connected. Everybody looks upward, and very few people look upward. And I think that is a big impediment now. But again, I think the pandemic is shaking things up, and hopefully we're going to see better connections among teachers, among schools, and among education systems.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us, Andreas.
Thank you, Clara.
And thanks for listening to OECD Podcasts. I'm Clara Young. To find out more about what we've been talking about, have a look at the OECD's latest Education at a Glance and 2 new OECD reports, the impact of COVID-19 on education and the economic impacts of learning losses.
To listen to other OECD podcasts, find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.